Somewhere beneath a tree in Warsaw, there were two glass jars buried in the dirt. Inside those jars were slips of paper. On each slip was a name. A child's real name, their Jewish name. And next to it, the false name they'd been given. The family hiding them, the convent sheltering them, the address where they could be found. 2,500 names. 2,500 children who were alive because a woman decided that watching them die was something she could not do. Her name was Irena Sendler, and this is the story of how a social worker with a bag, a clipboard, and more courage than most armies walked in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto and stole an entire generation of children from the Holocaust. Irena Kryżanowska was born on February 15, 1910, in Warsaw, Poland. Her father, Stanisław, was a physician. Not a wealthy one, a principled one. He treated anyone who walked through his door, regardless of whether they could pay. In the town of Oltwoc, where the family settled, roughly half the population was Jewish, and many of the poorest residents were among his patients. Other doctors in the area refused to treat Jews. Stanisław treated them for free. He taught his daughter one thing that would define the rest of her life. He said, "If someone else is drowning, you have to give a hand. Not should, have to." When Irena was 7, her father contracted typhus from one of his patients and died. He caught the disease doing what other doctors were too afraid to do. After his death, leaders from the Jewish community in Oltwoc offered financial help to his widow. Irena never forgot that. The people her father saved tried to save his family in return. She carried that debt for the rest of her life. At the University of Warsaw, Irena studied Polish literature. When the university introduced a system requiring Jewish students to sit in segregated sections, Irena defaced her own identity card in protest. She was suspended for 3 years. She didn't care. By the time she graduated and became a social worker in Warsaw, her moral compass was already locked. People were either good or bad. Race, religion, and nationality had nothing to do with it. "I was taught since my earliest years," she once said, "that people are either good or bad. Their race, nationality, and religion do not matter. What matters is the person." On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Warsaw fell, and overnight, the world Irena Sendler had built her life in was torn apart. Jews were stripped of their rights immediately. They couldn't hold government positions, couldn't own businesses, couldn't access their bank accounts. Irena, working in the city's Department of Social Welfare, was officially forbidden from helping Jewish residents. She started helping them anyway. She and a small group of colleagues forged documents, faked paperwork, and created phantom welfare cases to funnel food, money, and medicine to Jewish families. It was dangerous. Discovery meant death. Not just for Irena, but for everyone she worked with. Then, in 1940, the Nazis built a wall. 400,000 Jews were forced into a section of Warsaw roughly the size of 1 square mile. The Warsaw Ghetto. Sealed behind brick and barbed wire, guarded by soldiers. Anyone caught leaving without authorization was shot on sight. Inside the ghetto, people were dying by the thousands. Starvation, typhus, freezing cold. Children were the most vulnerable. They succumbed to disease faster than adults. They starved faster. Some parents sent their children to smuggle food from the other side of the wall, knowing the children might be shot, but also knowing they would certainly die without food. Irena, because of her position with the health department, obtained a pass from the Epidemic Control Department that allowed her legal entry into the ghetto. Officially, she was monitoring the spread of typhus. In reality, she was smuggling. She went in almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day. She carried food hidden in the false bottom of her bag, doses of typhus vaccine sewn into the lining of her clothes, medicine in her pockets. And sometimes, when no one was looking, she carried candy and dolls for the children. But food and medicine weren't enough. The ghetto was being liquidated. In July 1942, the Germans began mass deportations. The destination was Treblinka, the gas chambers. Entire families were being loaded onto trains and sent to their deaths. Irena Sendler decided that if she couldn't save the parents, she would save the children. She joined Zagota, the Council to Aid Jews, a Polish underground organization funded partly by the Polish government in exile. She was appointed head of its children's division and given the code name Jolanta. What followed was one of the most extraordinary rescue operations of the entire war. Irena and her network of roughly 24 colleagues developed methods to smuggle children out of the ghetto that sound like scenes from a thriller, except every one of them was real. They hid infants in the bottom of toolboxes. They carried babies out in suitcases. They placed toddlers in coffins and covered them with cloth, gambling that German guards wouldn't inspect a casket. They sedated small children and laid them on stretchers in ambulances, hiding them beneath the legs of patients being transported to hospitals. They led older children through the sewers, through underground passages, and through an old courthouse that straddled the ghetto wall, entering on the Jewish side and walking out the other. One of Irena's most effective tools was the simplest. She trained a dog to bark on command. She brought the dog with her when she transported sedated infants in her bag. If the baby made a sound, the dog barked louder. The guards heard the dog. They never heard the child. Every single rescue was a death sentence if caught. For Irena, for the family receiving the child, for everyone involved. In Nazi-occupied Poland, the penalty for hiding a Jew was execution of the entire household. Every Polish family that took in a child knew exactly what they were risking. The hardest part wasn't the smuggling, it was the asking. Irena had to stand in front of Jewish mothers and fathers and ask them to give up their children. She couldn't promise the children would survive. She couldn't promise the parents would survive. She could only say that the children had a chance on the other side of the wall and no chance inside it. Some parents said yes immediately, shoving their children into her arms before they could change their minds. Some said no at first, then changed their answer after watching another family be taken to the trains. Some could never bring themselves to let go. Those scenes over the ghetto wall were heart-rending, Irena said later. Sometimes fathers would agree, but mothers would not. I would often leave a house without the child. The next day I would return, and the family would be gone, taken to Treblinka. She placed the children with Polish Catholic families willing to take the risk. When she couldn't find families, she placed them in orphanages, convents, and care facilities run by nuns. Each child received a new name, a false identity, a fabricated history. The children had to forget who they were to survive. But Irena refused to let them be forgotten. She recorded every child's real name, their new name, and the address where they'd been placed. She wrote the information on slips of thin tissue paper, rolled them tight, and placed them inside glass jars. Then she buried the jars beneath a tree in a friend's garden. 2,500 names, the only proof these children had ever existed as who they truly were. On October 20th, 1943, The Gestapo came for Irena Sendler. They raided her apartment. She was arrested and taken to Powiat prison, the most notorious detention facility in occupied Warsaw. Few people who entered Powiat left alive. They tortured her. They broke both her legs. They fractured her feet. A young, well-dressed German officer who spoke perfect Polish sat across from her and demanded names. The names of her colleagues, the names of the families hiding children, the location of the lists. Irena had prepared for this moment. She and her network had rehearsed a cover story in case anyone was captured. She fed the interrogator the version they'd agreed on. She gave him nothing real. She received a death sentence. She was scheduled to be shot. On the day of her execution, she was led down a corridor, but instead of being taken to the room where prisoners waited to die, the guard led her to a door. He opened it. It led to the street. He told her to run. Zegota had bribed the guard. The price of Irena Sendler's life was paid in cash by the underground, and the German executioner pocketed the money and let her walk. The next day, Nazi officials posted her name on execution lists plastered across Warsaw. Irena Sendler had been shot, the posters announced. She was dead. She wasn't dead. She was in hiding, with a new identity, new documents, and the same mission. She continued smuggling children and coordinating rescues for the remainder of the war. When the war ended, Irena went back for the jars. She and a friend returned to the garden where she'd buried them. The neighborhood had been destroyed, rubble everywhere. They searched beneath the tree and dug them up. The names were intact. 2,500 children could now, in theory, be returned to their families. But there were almost no families left. The parents who had handed their children to Irena through ghetto walls, who had kissed them goodbye and watched them disappear into ambulances and suitcases and coffins, were almost all dead. Murdered at Treblinka, gassed, burned, gone. Irena spent years trying to reconnect the surviving children with any remaining relatives. Some found aunts, uncles, grandparents. Most found no one. The jars that were supposed to reunite families became memorials instead, a record of what was lost. Irena continued working as a social worker for the rest of her life. She adopted 2 orphaned Jewish girls herself. She lived quietly in communist Poland, where her wartime heroism was not celebrated. In 1965, Israel honored her as righteous among the nations. Poland gave her the Gold Cross of Merit, but the world didn't know her name. In 1999, 4 high school students in rural Kansas were given a homework assignment. Their teacher, Norman Kennard, handed them a newspaper clipping from 1994 that mentioned Irena Sendler in a single paragraph. The students were intrigued. They searched the internet and found almost nothing. One website. That was it. They wrote a play about her. They called it Life in a Jar. When they performed it, people wept. The story spread. Journalists called. The students traveled to Poland and met Irena, who was 90 years old, frail, and stunned that anyone cared. "I was stunned and fascinated," she said. "Very, very surprised." The play was performed hundreds of times across the world. Irena Sendler's name, buried for 60 years, was finally spoken aloud. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She didn't win. The prize that year went to Al Gore for a PowerPoint presentation about climate change. Irena Sendler saved 2,500 children from the gas chambers of Treblinka. Al Gore made a slideshow. The Nobel Committee chose the slideshow. When asked how she felt about losing, Irena didn't complain. She said something that tells you exactly who she was. The term hero irritates me greatly. The opposite is true. I continue to have pangs of conscience that I did so little. She did so little. 2,500 children. In jars. Beneath a tree. Irena Sendler died on May 12, 2008, in Warsaw. She was 98 years old. One of the youngest children she saved, a baby girl named Elżbieta Fikowska, who was smuggled out of the ghetto at 6 months old inside a carpenter's toolbox, cared for Irena in her final years. The baby in the toolbox grew up and spent her life thanking the woman who put her there. 2,500 names. 2,500 lives. Written on tissue paper, sealed in glass, and buried in the earth by a social worker who believed what her father taught her when she was 7 years old. If someone else is drowning, you have to give a hand.